Welcome to our series of videos on the resurrection. In the last video we looked at the subject, is the resurrection even important? And today we begin to look at the historical evidence for the resurrection. Christians base their belief in the resurrection on 5 historical facts, which we can remember using the mnemonic alive. And the first of those historical evidences is the A, which is a death by crucifixion. Now, in the New Testament, we have 4 independent eyewitnesses to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. We have Matthew and John, and then we also have the medical doctor Luke, who collated eyewitness reports to produce his gospel. Their evidence about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is further corroborated in the details by Roman and Jewish historians of the time, who agree about the mechanisms and details of how crucifixion occurred. And so this evidence is so secure that even the most skeptical scholars who don't believe the Bible acknowledge that the one thing we can know about Jesus of Nazareth is that he died by crucifixion. But before we even get to the crucifixion, we have to notice that Jesus was first beaten and then scourged. And so we read in Mark 15, verse 15, "So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified." Now, interestingly, this fulfills a couple of prophecies that were made some 700 years beforehand in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 52, verse 14. It says, "Many were astonished at you. His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind." And then Isaiah 53 verse 5 says, "And by his wounds we are healed." And the word there literally is by his stripes, as in the stripes of a tiger, referring to the lacerations across his back. So scourging was not a simple whipping or flogging. It was an intense punishment. The Romans did it using a thing called a flagellum, which was a collection of leather thongs that were attached together, and interwoven among the leather strips were small balls of metal, and even sometimes they interwove fragments of bone to cause maximum damage. And so as the subject was whipped with this flagellum, you had the metal balls causing contusions and hematomas in the muscle tissue as they were struck, and then you had the leather thongs and the bone fragments cutting into the skin and causing contusions to cut open, and more blood loss and causing deep lacerations across the back. So there was severe tissue damage to the skin and to the underlying muscles, and even some of the organs underneath were sometimes exposed by the severity of this scourging. Typically the Romans would use 39 lashes on someone, but sometimes it was more than that. And so there was great trauma and blood loss. So much so, in fact, that this was called the half-death, and some did not even survive the process of scourging. That then makes sense why, when Jesus was forced to carry his crossbeam, that he was too weak to do so, and they needed to press gang Simon of Cyrene to help him carry that beam of the cross. Now, Jesus was led then up to the hill of Golgotha, because the whole purpose of crucifixion was to publicly humiliate the criminal. And there we read, "There they crucified him." In crucifixion, the arms were stretched out, and large metal iron nails were driven through the area between the radius and the ulna in the wrist. Historians think that this was the case rather than the palm of the hand, because that could sustain the weight of the body as they were hung and crucified on the beam. And as those nerves were driven through, they pierced the median nerve, which is the nerve into the palm of your hand, causing intense pain and muscle spasms. And then spikes were driven into the bones of the feet as well. And we actually have archaeological evidence. Back in the 1960s, they discovered some bones of someone who'd been crucified. And they discovered the damage to the heels of the feet where those metal spikes had been driven through. And in fact, what had happened was the spike driven through had hit a knot in the wood and had buckled. And so they couldn't remove the spike from the foot before burial. And so the bone still had this metal spike in it. And so this was designed to cause intense pain. In fact, our word excruciating comes from crucifixion because of how painful this form of death was. So what killed someone who was being crucified? Well, the whole purpose of crucifixion was for it to be an extended torment, and it could last anywhere up to 3 days. The mechanism of death was as follows, was that the whole purpose was to weaken the victim through the damage that was done to their body. And as they hung from their arms, and as they sank down, as they were weakened, they would increasingly struggle to breathe. And so they would have to push up against the damaged and crushed bones of their feet and pull up against the damaged and injured bones of their wrists in order to raise their rib cage enough to be able to gasp a breath. And imagine that lacerated back rubbing up against the rough wood of the cross each time you needed to breathe. And then exhausted, they would sink back down until they needed to repeat the whole process again in order to take the next breath. So imagine how precious each word was that Jesus spoke from the cross. Gradually, as they deteriorated and weakened more and more, that effort to push up and to breathe was becoming too much. And so slowly and gradually, they would die of asphyxiation or of heart failure due to their inability to breathe. And it was specifically designed to take days and to draw out this death, this agonizing death, as long as possible. Now, in order to hasten death, sometimes they would break the legs of those who were being crucified. And we read in the Jewish law, this specific law in Deuteronomy 21 verse 22 about people hanging on trees. It says, "If a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance." So in Jewish law, the hanged person, the crucified person, was not allowed to remain upon the cross after nightfall. And so what happens is that to hasten that death, which was supposed to take days, they would come and with a large wooden mallet, they would break and fracture the legs so that the victim could no longer push up against their legs, using their legs against their feet in order to take each of those breaths, and therefore they would much more quickly suffocate and die. And so this then makes sense of John's account in John 19 and verse 31, where we read, "Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him." Now, interestingly, in that archaeological skeleton that was discovered, his legs were broken as well, just showing that this man had suffered this exact fate being described here. But Jesus had already died before that point, which was actually surprising that he had died so quickly. And so we read in verse 33, But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. This fulfills another prophecy. In addition to the prophecies of Isaiah, 1,000 years ago, there are prophecies written by David in the book of Psalms. They've pierced my hands and my feet. And then there's this prophecy in Psalm 34, verse 20. Not one of his bones will be broken. Now, it was unusual for someone to die on the cross as quickly as Jesus did. And so, to make sure that he really had died, they took a Roman spear, and one of the Roman soldiers thrust that spear into his thorax. And so we read in verse 34, but one of the soldiers pierced his side, literally his thorax, with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. And so this was a death blow to ensure that the victim was really dead. The spear was thrust up into the rib cage. Now, if it was thrust into the right-hand side of the rib cage, then obviously it would penetrate into the lung and puncture the lung and hasten the death by suffocation. And if it was thrust up into the left-hand side, then it would puncture the heart and kill the person through the trauma to the heart. So either way, whether you were dying through puncture to the heart or puncture to the lung, it was ensuring that you were dead. And even if you'd managed to survive that, which was pretty much impossible, obviously you now have a massive cut and trauma to your lungs, a thing called a pneumothorax, which is where air can enter into the rib cage through a separate mechanism, and this causes your lungs to collapse. And a large pneumothorax like that, untreated with no medical intervention, would mean death pretty quickly through suffocation anyway. So however you want to play it, all the evidence points to Jesus being dead. And it says, and out came blood and water. Now this mixture of blood and water was either due to the swelling of the pericardial fluid due to heart failure, and as the heart was pierced, out came this blood and this clear liquid from the pericardial fluid, or it was due to the filling of the lungs with fluid due to this asphyxiation. And so as the lungs were pierced, out came this clear liquid and this blood. Either way, indicating that Jesus was truly dead. So who crucified Jesus? Well, it was Roman soldiers who were professional executioners. And so making sure that people died from crucifixion was their job. And they were overseen by a centurion. And before they gave the body of the victim to be given for burial, they would ensure that the person was dead, because the whole point of crucifixion was to kill them. So they would have checked the corpse before they handed it over to be buried. Now, has anyone ever survived crucifixion? Well, yes, actually, there is one recorded case in history of someone surviving crucifixion. And this is recorded by the historian Josephus. And what happened was, 3 men were being crucified, and an appeal was made to the Roman emperor that they should be spared. And so the Roman emperor actually pardoned them. And so their crucifixion was interrupted, and they were released from the cross, and they were brought down, and they received medical treatment immediately. But even after all of that, this kind of interrupted crucifixion, 2 of the men still died from the wounds inflicted by the crucifixion. But this one man survived this short crucifixion that was interrupted by a pardon from the Caesar. But as you can see, that is nothing like Jesus' situation, with all the injuries that he sustained, the trauma and the damage to his body, and then the fact that he died, that his legs were not broken, that he received this spear injury to his thorax to ensure that he was dead, and was then taken down. He would have been checked before he was then given over for burial. So the first piece of evidence in the resurrection is the fact that we have a corpse. The Lord Jesus Christ had died on the cross by a death from crucifixion. Tune in tomorrow as we look at the next piece of evidence.